Scripture reading this morning will come from Ezekiel chapter 18, verses 19 through 20. Ezekiel 18, 19 through 20. Yet you say, why should not the Son suffer for the iniquity of the Father? When the Son has done what is just and right, and has been careful to observe all my statutes, he shall surely live. The soul who sins shall die. The Son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the Father, nor the Father suffer for the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself.
Good morning, church. It's good to have everybody here today, especially if you're a guest with us. We have several tourists in the area today, so we're glad that y'all took some time out of your travels to be here and worship with us today. And we hope that it's encouraging for you. I hope that everybody got a family report as you were coming in this morning, and if you didn't and you want one of those, you can raise your hand and these guys will bring it to you. There's a place on the back page with an outline, and that'll help us track through some probably less familiar territory out of the book of Jeremiah today. So that's what we're planning with this message, okay? I want to say Happy Father's Day. We are going to talk about dads here. I always try to do a Mother's Day and Father's Day message every year, and so this is it. But just to my fellow dads, I hope that you are honored today, and I appreciate what you do, and I've prayed for you this morning, and will continue to do that. So just wanted to throw it out there as my well wishes for this beautiful day for you. What do you remember about your dad? Those of you who he is sort of either in the past because you don't live with him now, or he's already gone on to his eternal reward, or those of you that are forming your memories of your dad, what do you think are going to be the enduring memories of your dad? It's a surprisingly tricky question to ask to a group of people because it can go 100 different directions, and not all of them are positive, and I know that. But the memories that we have of our fathers tend to run really deep, and they tend to really have a strong influence on who we are, sometimes in good ways and sometimes in bad ways. But possibly more than any other human-to-human relationship, that one tends to have a strong influence. A lot can be, I hesitate to say determined, because it's not determined, it is influenced. A lot can be influenced in your life by whether your dad is present or absent, by whether he's kind or harsh, whether he's lazy or he's diligent, whether he's religious or he's antagonistic, whether he's honest or whether he's a hypocrite. A lot of things can be really influenced in a person's life by the father figure and the character that he has. And so I think that just kind of tells us the impact that the relationship has when you just ask a group of people a simple question of, what would be your memory of your dad? And it gets emotionally tricky. That just tells us how important this role is. And so that's why I think it's an important thing for us to talk about at least once a year, if not more than that. And we are talking about it some in our men's class on Wednesday nights as well, because this topic matters a great deal. But what I want to do today, and really I think this is my goal every Father's Day when I write the sermon for that particular Sunday, is to kind of fight the societal expectation for dads, right? Because the expectation, the societal expectation, is that dad is often lazy and incompetent, and especially in matters of fatherhood and parenthood, he really doesn't know what he's doing so well. And I want us to just turn that expectation around. I think this is one of the places where God's people ought to shine like a light out of darkness. That when people look to the men in the kingdom of God, they see a paradigm being shattered. That they see men who expect something better of themselves because they know they have a Father in heaven who expects better of them. And they're willing to step up to what is good and right and to exhibit the virtues that will help future generations to continue to exhibit those virtues as well. So all that to say, that's my goal today. And to get us toward that goal, I want to show you a really wonderful narrative from the book of Jeremiah. If you have a Bible, I'd love for everybody to open it because we're going to read together today. Jeremiah chapter 35. This is page 621 in the Pew Bibles, if that's helpful for you. And this is going to be a passage that you may have heard this one talked about at some point, but probably not very many times, if at all. And it's this really wonderful narrative about a conversation between God and the prophet Jeremiah that's going to go on to be a sermon for the rest of the people. So that's kind of what's happening here, okay? In Jeremiah 35, God is preaching a sermon, and he does it with an object lesson based on the family of a man named Jonadab. And that's where we start with chapter 35, verse 1. Let's read the words of God. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. Go to the house of the Rechabites, and speak with them, and bring them to the house of the Lord into one of the chambers, then offer them wine to drink. So I took Jazaniah, the son of Jeremiah, the son of Habazaniah. I'm going to skip some names. I just can't do it. I tried reading them and I can't do it. Okay. I brought them into the house, and the whole house of the Rechabites, I brought them into the house of the Lord. Look at verse 5. Then I set before the Rechabites pitchers full of wine and cups, and I said to them, drink wine. But they answered, we will drink no wine, for Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, commanded us, you shall not drink wine, neither you nor your sons forever. You shall not build a house, you shall not sow seed, you shall not plant or have a vineyard, but you shall live in tents all your days, that you may live many days in the land where you sojourn. We have obeyed the voice of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, in all that he commanded us, to drink no wine all our days, ourselves, our wives, our sons, or our daughters, and not to build houses to dwell in. We have no vineyard or field or seed, but we have lived in tents and have obeyed and done all that Jonadab, our father, commanded us. But when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against the land, we said, come, let us go to Jerusalem for fear of the army of the Chaldeans and the army of the Syrians, and so we are living in Jerusalem. And then the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, thus says Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, go out and say to the people of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, will you not receive instruction and listen to my words, declares Yahweh. The command that Jonadab the son of Rechab gave to his sons to drink no wine has been kept, and they drink none to this day, for they have obeyed their father's command. I have spoken to you persistently, but you have not listened to me. Okay. First of all, let's just point out the fact that it is really cool that there's a dad in this family, a patriarch figure in this family, who has done so much good for his family that God says, I tried to be like that dad and get you to be like his family. That, brothers and sisters, is a powerful statement. When God himself looks up to a family and says, I tried to make my people like them, that is a powerful commendation of the faith of a particular father and his family. And if that's all that we got out of this passage, it would be a remarkable lesson for us, because this is just one of the coolest ways that God ever explained himself to his people. He uses plenty of really wonderful object lessons and metaphors and illustrations in Jeremiah's preaching, but this has to be one of my favorites. To look at this level of devotion from these people and to say, I wish that my own people were like that. The Rechabites, that's their family name. They are known by an ancestor whose name is Rechab. It's the same way that your surname, your last name is passed down from generation to generation. And this is their name. They have a long-gone ancestor whose name they still wear, the Rechabites. But it is Jonadab, their father, who gets pointed out here as the one to be the example that others look to as the influential father figure for them. Now, as I read that, I don't know if you're the type to kind of put mental pictures of these narratives in your brain, okay, and like formulate what this actually looked like as it was taking place. But the first time that I read it, my mental picture was that here's these guys, they're standing in the temple, they're having this conversation with Jeremiah. He sets out the table and he says, come on guys, have some wine. And they say no. And Jonadab is outside the door of the temple listening, and he's going, oh, they got it. They got it. I told them the rules, and they actually cared enough to obey the rules. They really devoted themselves to this. And then he has this like proud father moment standing outside overhearing what's going on. The problem with viewing the scenario that way is that Jonadab has been dead for 250 years at this point in the story. So this regulation, this set of regulations on their family, is a permanently influential thing that goes back to the influence of a man who's been gone for 2.5 centuries. But when it comes time to test their integrity, they still speak his name and say, this is the conviction that we hold to. Now again, the layers to this are actually really, really wonderful. Because again, God looks up to this family. God says, I wish my people were like that family. And even more than that, look at how devoted this family is and how long it's been. We talked in communion about a long-term relationship. This is a picture of one, isn't it? This kind of faithfulness goes on for a long time. But here's another thing that's helpful about this particular narrative. If you go searching for the connections for the rest of the family and where this story actually came from, the Bible's going to tell us a good deal more about these folks to help us absorb a second layer to the real impact of this. So can I get you this time to turn your Bible to 2 Samuel chapter 4. We're going back several hundred years in Israelite history now. And if we go back to 2 Samuel 4, which you're going to find on page 240, we're going to learn a little bit about Jonadab's ancestor who solidified the Rechab family name. And he did so, unfortunately, by attaching shame to the family name. This is really interesting to me. Go back to 2 Samuel chapter 4, and when you look through verses 1 through 12, the situation is that David has just come to power as king over the Israelites. Saul has just been killed, and a few of Saul's sons are still living, but David has just come to power as the new king. So those sons are going to have no claim on this throne. But here's what's interesting about it. There is a guy, his name is Rechab, who goes out hunting one of Saul's sons that's still alive. And he kills him, and he takes his head, and he comes back carrying the head, bringing it to King David, expecting a hero's welcome, because you're the new king, and I just took out a competitor to your throne, and this is going to go really well, right? Start reading with me in verse 8. Rechab and his brother brought the head of Saul's son to David at Hebron. And they said to the king, here is the head of the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. The Lord has avenged my lord the king this day on Saul and on his offspring. But David answered Rechab and Baanah his brother, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when someone told me, behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more, when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house on his bed, shall I not now require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth? And David commanded his young men, and they killed them. So the question is, why did Rechab die? It's because he was being impulsive and stupid and violent, and he was not doing the will of the Lord. This is a guy who walks into the scene not to say to the new king, hey, we inquired of the Lord and we did what he said, and it turns out it helps you. This is a guy who's sniveling at the feet of whoever happens to be in power next. David's winning more battles than the sons of Saul. Why don't we just kill off those sons of Saul? Hey, you got a sword, right? Yeah, let's go kill somebody. And hey, King David, we want to be on your side. We want you to like us. And so his name becomes tainted because he's complicit in the murder of a good person. Reminds me of a story from American history, doesn't it you? It's a story of a man who didn't commit a murder in this country, but he was complicit in a well-known murder in this country, and his name has been forever besmirched because of it. His name is Mudd, Dr. Samuel Mudd. That was the doctor that assisted John Wilkes Booth in killing Lincoln. And it's that kind of shame that's attached to Dr. Mudd's name today that gets attached to the name of Rechab in their day because of the things that he's done. Now, I went from Jeremiah back several hundred years in Israelite history to show you that incident so that we can kind of go to an incident that happens right in the middle that I think helps to clarify both of them. Can you go to 2 Kings chapter 10 this time? This time is page 295 in our Pew Bibles. 2 Kings chapter 10. And in 2 Kings chapter 10, we have another story of somebody from the family of Rechab being pretty violent again, but it's under very different circumstances this time. So what's happening now in 2 Kings chapter 10 is that the Lord is overthrowing a dynasty of kings who have really disobeyed him. It's Ahab's family, so you know how bad it is, okay? He's been incredibly unfaithful, and all the heirs of Ahab have been unfaithful, and so God is wiping out that entire line of kings. They've all been worshiping idols, and he's going to put a king on the throne who will do a better job, and hopefully not serve idols. And so in 2 Kings chapter 10, in verse 15, we finally get to meet Jonadab. And Jonadab is getting into the chariot with God's newly chosen king. And what is it that they do together? Well, they go on to create this big festival where they're going to pull all the worshipers of other gods together in one room, and they're going to trick them and say, confess your loyalty to this other god. And anybody that does, Jehu and Jonadab are going to wipe them out, because God is purging the land. And so this is what we read starting in verse 23. Jehu went into the house of Baal with Jonadab, the son of Rechab. There he is. And he said to the worshipers of Baal, search and see that there is no servant of Yahweh here among you, but only worshipers of Baal. And they went in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now Jehu had stationed 80 men outside and said, the man who allows any of those to whom I give into your hands to escape shall forfeit his own life. So as soon as he made an end of offering the burnt offering, Jehu said to the guard and to his officers, go in and strike them down. Let not a man escape. So they went in and put them to the sword. The guard and the officers cast them out and went into the inner room of the house of Baal. They brought out the pillar that was in the house of Baal and burned it. And they demolished the pillar of Baal, demolished the house of Baal. They made it a latrine to this day. There's one Christian comedian who says the Bible's got some crazy stuff in it. It's a wonder you don't see many of those illustrations in the Precious Moments Bible. Now, this is one of those, okay? You don't have that in that particular set of illustrations. But the question is kind of much bigger than that. It's funny, like, why is this okay? Why is what these two men do commendable? Why does Jonadab get commended for being an accomplice to this sort of violence? The difference is between innocence and guilt. Rechab went and struck down an innocent man in his house, in his bed, and thought King David would celebrate him. Generations later, though, Jonadab allies himself with a new king of God's people who sees clearly the guilt of those who have forsaken God. And yes, he picks up a sword and fights too, but he fights for the right reasons against guilty people. Jonadab is part of destroying the idolatry from the land of God. He is doing the will of God. He is a helper to the king, not an unspiritual coward like his ancestor. This guy really wants to help. And that's the backstory then that gets us all the way back to Jeremiah 35, where God brings these people in who are descendants of Jonadab, and he says to them, here's your opportunity to do something to break away from the convictions of your ancestor Jonadab. And they say, no, we're not doing that, because we're carrying on a legacy from that man who did the right thing generations ago. And we'll continue to do what he taught us even today. He sets an example as a godly father figure so that successive generations follow him so closely that God wishes his own family could be like theirs. Jeremiah 35 and verse 14, the command that Jonadab, the son of Rechab, gave to his sons to drink no wine has been kept, and they drink none to this day. For they have obeyed their father's command. But I have spoken to you persistently, and you have not listened to me. Jonadab is such a good dad. What a great fatherly figure in this story. And so now that I've told you what it involves, what all the story involves, and how it got to the point of excellence that it is in Jeremiah's time, let me make a handful of observations from it about how we can live our lives for the glory of God as well. So now we talked about the family of Jonadab. Let's talk about you and your family. Dads, Jonadab teaches us to be faithful with the family that you have. Jonadab redeemed his family's name from a terrible mistake by truly seeking to do the will of God and make sure that other people were serving him. And this is where Jonadab's family gives us hope, Dad. Okay, because whatever family you've been given, whatever family you've inherited, there is hope to do the right thing. You cannot control the family that you inherit, but you can control the family that you have and the good that you pour into that. And so if there are shameful things in your family history, like there were for Jonadab, you're not slave to that. You're not stuck with that family name. And thank God that we're not, okay? My story about this, I promised you a few weeks ago I would tell you a story from my family history. So here it is. I was 19 years old, I think, and I was at church in Florida. I had gone down there to go to college, and I was at church in Florida, and I led singing on a Wednesday night. This was my first Wednesday night there. The next Sunday morning, my third time ever attending this church, this lady walks up to me and she says, "Hey, are you the song leader from Wednesday night?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "Did they say your last name is Langford?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "Okay, now, are you by any chance from Dixon, Tennessee?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And my ears kind of perked up a little, And she said, "Okay, now, are you related to John Langford?" And I said, "Oh, yes, ma'am, this is my grandpa." And she said, "Okay, now, let me make sure I've got this right. Your great-great-great-uncle shot and killed my great-grandfather on the steps of the Pomona Church of Christ on a Sunday morning after worship." And I said, "It's nice to meet you too." Now, do you know, my family had never told me that story. But it was true. It went back to 1917, and she had the newspaper clipping to prove it. Now, she was not mad at me. But I never heard that story before, And I knew a whole different version of my family. I had a whole different picture of them. And all of a sudden now, there's this lady standing in front of me who can tell me a story about my family that doesn't make the Langford name sound nearly as good as it used to. And I actually, come to think of it, there's a connection here in Colorado Springs with that same family as well. So like 8 months ago, a sister from Northeast Church of Christ called me and she said, "Hey, there's somebody over at my house that knows you. Would you like to come over and hang out?" And it turns out it was part of that same family. That we had done the killing to their family, Anyway, all of that to say, I can't fix that, Like, I'm glad that a lot of people don't know about it, but I can't take it away. I can't go back to 1917 and undo what two foolish Langfords did on Sunday morning after church. I can't change that. I know that I've inherited a family legacy that has some shame attached to the name in some way. But here's what's really great about that, and here's the reason that I'm not embarrassed to tell that story. Because my great-grandparents, the very next generation, took that family legacy, that family name, and they spun a 180. And from there, my grandparents picked up their legacy, and they were really wonderful, faithful people. And my grandfather took up preaching the gospel, and so did 2 of his sons and 1 of his sons-in-law, and so did 6 of his grandsons, which includes me. And so there's a legacy there that has just completely changed the trajectory of what they inherited in their family name. This, by the way, is the photo of me, my boys, my dad, and my grandpa. 4 generations of Langfords right there. And 3 of those generations owing credit to much of who we are to that man in the gray sport coat standing in the back right there. He is a remarkable man. And these are the artifacts that tell the current version of our story. There's a newspaper clipping out there somewhere that says our family's a bunch of murderers, but then I have these. These are my grandfather's sermon outlines that he's given me, that occasionally you may get to hear one of these sermons. My version of it, not his, but still, it started from someone who was teaching others to teach the truth. And then this is his record of all the churches that he's preached for, and the gospel meetings that he's held, and the countless people that he's baptized and buried and married and all the good that's been done in the generations since 1917. So I'm saying all that to say that really all of us have ways in which we inherit a name that we may or may not want, but it's not up to us to continue necessarily the bad that we've inherited. It's up to us to make good on whatever the generations preceding have given us. And so maybe you had a dad who was absent. Well, then you be there for your family. You be present with them. Maybe you had a dad who was drunk. Then you be the sober one who is always in control and using good judgment and being the person you should be. Maybe you had a dad that got complacent, who was lazy, he just didn't work hard, he didn't do what he was supposed to do, he shirked his responsibilities. Then you be the industrious one. You be the diligent one who turns things around and shows future generations a better example. Maybe you had a dad who was mean and who was miserly, who would pinch a penny until it screamed. Then you be the person who says, I'll be generous with what I have. I'm not going to hold on to it too tight. I'm going to give it to other people and be a blessing to them. Brothers, we got to fight the temptation to wish for something better or different or more than what we have. I have to fight the temptation to think, if I'd been given something better, I'd be doing a lot better. If my wife were more spiritually minded, more encouraging, working harder, if she was prettier, then I'd be a good husband. If my kids were more intelligent, more respectful, more talented, if they listened better, if they hadn't inherited my parents' issues, then we would be a good family, put it all together and be who we're supposed to be. No. We've got to do better than that. We need to fight the temptation to wish for something better and be godly with the family that we have now. That's our responsibility. That's what we're called to. Yes, a previous generation of father figures may have failed. It doesn't mean that we will too. You can't control the name you inherit, but you can be faithful with what you have. Jonadab inherited a family name that was known to the kings of his nation as a coward's family. The Rechabites. Oh yeah, we know about them from David's time. But the family of Jonadab, they're the ones who get brought into the temple for God to say, I wish my people were more like you. Be faithful with the family that you have. And pass on your principles as well. Jonadab is interesting because he sets down this different set of rules for his people. He actually goes beyond the law. And he says, for me and my house, this is the set of rules that we're going to follow from here on out. Jonadab has a whole separate set of rules that God didn't command of them, but he said, this is who we're going to be. And in doing that, he passed on those principles in a way that they went generation to generation to generation. And this is something that God's men, God's servants, are supposed to do. It was supposed to be that way in every generation. In Deuteronomy 6, the command was, you teach your children the ways of God. When? When you stand up, when you lie down, when you go out, when you come in, when you're out on the road, when you're out on the farm, when you're at home. You teach them the ways of God everywhere so that they will teach it to their generation and their next generation and their next generation. The idea was that it would get passed on. And the same is true when we get to Ephesians 6. The responsibility is put primarily on fathers to pass on the faith to the next generation. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but fathers, bring them up in the nurture and the admonition, in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. I think we have a wrong impression if we believe that it's up to the moms to indoctrinate the children into the faith. That the men are supposed to go to work, teach adult classes, and the women are supposed to teach the children and give them their faith. I think we have the wrong impression if that's what we're picturing. Because the Bible says, fathers, do that instructing. You teach your children. And so dads, we're not going to get to roll up that responsibility and toss it at mom's feet and say, you take care of it. It's up to us to pass on the principles to the next generation. By the way, why is it that you think Jonadab had the convictions that he did and gave those to his children? Is it just because he wanted to be special? He wanted other people to look up to them and say, wow, aren't they like really super hyper spiritual? No, it's because they lived in a time, Jonadab lived in a time where the prophets were preaching against the people's drunkenness and gluttony. And Jonadab said, okay, if that's the message, then we're going to respond to that message, and we're going to get rid of drunkenness and gluttony in our lives. And he lived in a time when the prophets were preaching against the people who lived in opulence and extravagance. They had big homes, but they didn't give to the poor. And so Jonadab said, okay, we're going to respond to that message. We're going to make sure that we live in tents and that what we have it to share with others. We're not going to get caught up in the opulence and the extravagance. We're going to make sure that we serve God and put our faith in Him. And Jonadab lived in a time when the prophets were preaching against the people because they got lazy and they were complacent and they were rich, fat, and happy and thought they didn't need God. And he taught his family a way of life that they could never get complacent with where they were living. They were nomads living in tents. And he said, this is how we're going to do our life, so that our dependence is not on ourselves and our houses and our riches. It's on God. Jonadab's story shows us, brothers, that you don't have to do anything great to be great in the eyes of God. You just have to pass on a legacy of faithfulness and virtue to future generations. Y'all know the Babylon Bee, that satire website? Several years ago, Babylon Bee posted a silly on Father's Day, and it said, "Father of three wonders when he'll get the chance to influence anyone for Christ." It ain't that funny, but it makes a point, right? Father of three wonders when he's going to get a chance to influence anyone for Christ. And the story was all about how all I seem to do is I get my job done, and then I come home and I play with my kids and put them to bed and spend time with them. And I don't know if I'm ever going to have anyone in my life that I can have an impact with and lead them to Jesus. Amen. Like, you get it? You know? They're right there. Those are the ones. And so, dads, don't think that we have to do something great and impressive and world-changing for God's sake. Just live out your convictions. Pass on the truth of who we're supposed to be so that your children will learn to live that out as well. Now, one quick thing here for the rest of us, and that is that when we think about who we're supposed to be as younger generations, let's do our best to honor our father and our fathers. Honor your father and your mother. That's the phrase given in the Ten Commandments, repeated in Ephesians. That phrase shows up everywhere. Let me go ahead and ask you to just mark it out, change it in your outline right there. Honor your father and your fathers. Because this is a regulation that's given in both covenants as well. In Deuteronomy 5:16, we have the repetition of the Ten Commandments where God says, honor your father and mother. Why? So that it may go well with you and that your days in the land may be long. But then you get to Ephesians chapter 6, and it says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And what's the reason for that? Because it's the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you and that you will live long in the land. I get really tired of the Father's Day cards that say, Dear Dad, I learned a lot from you, and I learned from Mom how to do better than all of it. I get really tired of that. Okay, that's not really the right way to speak to a generation that has at least taught us one good thing in some way. If there's even that we can attach ourselves to, then let's honor those who have taught us the ways that we are supposed to live. I think we need to change our expectations about this, that we learn to honor those who have taught us the ways to go. Now, the way that we can do that is the point right before, that we honor their principles. Again, from Jeremiah 35. Jonadab's descendants answered and said, we will drink no wine, for Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, commanded us, these are all the things that you shouldn't do. And we have kept his command to this day. Don't look back with disdain on those who came before us, everybody. Let's honor those who have taught us the ways of life in good and healthy ways. Now, to put all that together, and just to kind of, nail it down, let me ask you this one question. If you prayed to God and you said, for the sake of your children, dads, my fellow dads, if you said for the sake of your children, Lord, I want you to make them just like me, would you want God to answer that question, to answer that prayer? Lord, I want you to make them just like me. Now, obviously what we really hope for is, Lord, I want you to make them better than me. Like, even at my best, I really hope they're better than me. But I have a feeling that most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, would be a little too afraid to even ask the question, to even request that of God. Because I want my sons to be not only a little better than me, I want them to be far better than the father figure that they've had in their lives. What I want them to attain to is the glory and the goodness of their Father in heaven. And I know I'm not anywhere close to that. So it's just something worth thinking about, my fellow dads. Are we living the kind of life that prayer might even a little bit make sense? That God would answer us and make them just like us, and we would still be proud of who they had become. That's just something to think about. It's a convicting question for me every time that I think about it, and I hope that it is for you. So, we get to the end of this. We get to the end of this discussion about Jonadab, and we actually cut short our reading in Jeremiah 35. So do you still have your Bible? Can we go back there? Jeremiah 35 one more time. We cut short our reading because God held them up and said, I wish my children would listen to me and keep my ways the same way Jonadab's children have. But here's what's interesting about this. Let's read the last 2 verses of the chapter, last few sentences. But to the house of the Rechabites, Jeremiah said, Thus says Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, because you have obeyed the command of Jonadab your father, and kept all his precepts and done all that he commanded you, therefore, thus says Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, Jonadab the son of Rechab shall never lack a man to stand before me. I wish I knew the rest of their family history after that, don't you? Because it would be remarkable to think of the impact and the legacy of these people and how it continued on after a promise like that. That God said, you will never lack a man to stand in the gap before me through all the generations of your family that are yet to come. That is a pretty special promise. With faith like that, I really hope we have a lot we can learn from them. I'm grateful to a preacher named Andrew Roberts who pointed out this story and the impact of it to me and how it's kind of woven through the fabric of the Bible, because it's been a good reminder for me about leaving a legacy of godliness and virtue and masculinity and honesty and all these different things and spirituality with my sons. And I hope that it is for you as well. If your family situation isn't good, there is hope that you can turn it around. And if your family situation is good, then keep your faith in God and give that legacy to somebody else who will come behind you in this great long running of time. Because that's the inheritance of faithfulness that we're called to give to every generation. Will you stand in the gap and make sure that that's the Father's legacy of faith that you pass on to them? If there's anybody among us today that has a spiritual need that you want to make known in a public way, we want to give you this opportunity to do it, to talk to me or to one of the shepherds about that, so that we can open the Bible and help you take the next steps toward faithfully serving Christ. So if you want to come and tell us about that, why don't you do that while we're standing together and singing this hymn.